Swinburne University of Technology.
I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present. Speaking of respects, I should also like to thank our hosts here this evening, Beverly Rayner, Telstra representative and one of our alumni, who secured this fantastic venue for us. A very convenient and very open venue. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Helen Imber, who has brought us all together here this evening in her customarily cordial and professional way. Thank you very much, Helen. A brief word before we begin about the Asia Pacific Centre at Swinburne. As most of you know, it was founded with the support of private donors over 10 years ago and has maintained very close links with the philanthropy and non-profit sector over that time. Until early this year, it was ably directed by Dr. Michael Lithman, supported by capable staff, including Dr. Michael Moran, one of our speakers this evening, but also Christopher and Elizabeth and Helen. I'm John Fitzgerald, successor as director, although Michael is still very active in the centre and is my mentor in this role. And the Asia Pacific Centre is privileged to have the support of a committed and influential alumni group, SPA, graduates of the Masters and Graduate Certificate program in philanthropy and social impact, and of a rapidly growing and expanding cohort of new and current students who are today's activists and tomorrow's leaders, and we're delighted to welcome graduates and students here this evening. Now, I have a pre-announcement to make, which is only remotely related to tonight's events, and that's that our centre, the Asia Pacific Centre, will be establishing a new centre at Swinburne University next year, a Swinburne Centre for Social Impact. And the Asia Pacific Centre will be embedded in that new Centre for Social Impact, which is part of the national network of centres, and will be jointly funded by Swinburne University and the federal grant, which has been supporting the Centre for Social Impact at the University of New South Wales. We are currently recruiting new staff, a director, professorial level director, and senior research officer for that new centre. This will enable the current configuration of the Asia Pacific Centre to focus on philanthropy within the CSI network, and yet to extend its reach, its activity and its interests beyond philanthropy as such, more broadly into the non-profit sector. So we are thrilled that this is going forward and will be formally announced later this year, and I hope you might be free to attend a function which will announce that, and then launched at the beginning of next year. And the Centre is also delighted to be planning a series of pretty bold initiatives starting next year, also to be announced fairly shortly. This evening's an opportunity, in a sense, to foreshadow one of these new initiatives, and to foreshadow it by honouring and congratulating Gina Anderson on the completion and publication of her report, Where the Money Goes, Private Wealth for Public Good, with which we were remotely associated and for which he gave us far too much credit in the introduction. And also to thank her for joining us to discuss the place of philanthropy, transparency in philanthropy in Australia and the world today. Now, the question of whether private donors should share information and data publicly is an issue that divides people in the sector in this country. And so it might, and so it should. On the one side, among the transparency advocates, are those who would argue that, for a start, information sharing improves practice, that the discipline of outside or public scrutiny pretty well ensures that an organisation's and institution's grants and investment will align with the goals and principles. Knowing that others are looking over your shoulder is a wonderful discipline for ensuring that kind of alignment. It also improves practice, they argue, because shared knowledge facilitates strategic investment. That is, each actor knows what the other's doing and can locate themselves strategically in a field, the general outlines of which are known and shared by all. The second argument generally made is that information sharing reduces transaction costs for some. That other segments of the non-profit sector, the innovative doers out there, the grant seekers or investment seekers, lack, in the present climate, lack the information to guide their approaches to funders, which adds to their operational costs and is a burden, in fact, for each of the doers. A third range of arguments turn on how information sharing can improve communication and public trust. This may or may not be the case in Australia, but it's certainly the case abroad. That the discipline of open sharing of information can reduce the likelihood of blunders and scandals in the sector, although they are going to happen anyway. But that discipline of knowing there's a high level of public scrutiny can reduce the risk. Secondly, that sharing impact measures can build public confidence that the claims we're making for the sector are borne out by evidence. If the evidence is not there and yet we're making those claims, it's very difficult to substantiate them publicly. Third, that general information sharing gives a clearer picture, gives everybody a clearer picture of the size, the diversity, the activities, and all aspects of the national donor effort, which at the moment are pretty opaque. There's not a whole lot. It's very, very difficult to establish even the size of the philanthropy sector in Australia in the present climate. And finally, that the public demand for government or public transparency is actually lifting the bar for everybody, and that the expectations of ordinary citizens for transparency are pretty high at this point. It's just the nature of the political culture where we're at in civil society, and raising the bar for all of us presents challenges. On the other side are those who are wary of the effect or of the likely transformative impact of greater transparency on the sector. After all, they argue, private donors are not called private for nothing. They're modest and don't seek the limelight. They're generous and public-spirited and should not be pilloried on that account. They're shy of the headlights and could be frightened off by public exposure, which could reduce the size of the financial commitment. And they're run by voluntary labour, which really cannot bear the compliance costs of regulated transparency. Not being government or public donors, they then shouldn't be held to standards of public transparency because they're not public. Finally, and this is an argument that can be quite persuasive to my mind, insofar as transparency is not easily enforced by regulation, so it shouldn't be regulated. Now, there's merit on all sides, and our purpose in convening today's forum is to invite speakers and all present to share their views on the issue of transparency, to share their perspectives, to help us identify some of the areas of agreement and areas of disagreement. In turn, that will help our centre to develop a research agenda focusing on the pros and cons of transparency to provide the sort of evidence base we might need to help us advance on this issue generally. Let me ask, if I may, a couple of hands-up questions. I guess if you've come along tonight, you have thought about transparency at some point or another. Who has given some thought to this issue of transparency in philanthropy? Who among us? Could you please hold your hands up? That was a simple question. Okay. Some of you may have an interest in sharing your ideas here as well. Who would like, how many of us would like to participate in the discussion? We'll have an opportunity to discuss at the end. A smaller group, but I would invite all to consider doing so. Now allow me to introduce the speakers, if I may, briefly before we move forward. In order of presentation. Mike Moran is a research fellow in the Asia Pacific Centre and completed his PhD on the role of private foundations in public-private partnership formation at the University of Melbourne. A revised version of that is appearing as a book through an internationally refereed press very shortly. He has lectured and tutored in public policy, international relations and international political economy at the University of Melbourne and Deakin before joining us at Swinburne. And Michael will give us an international perspective on this issue. That is, what's happening globally, so that we can situate ourselves in a grid of international development and transparency. Michael will be followed by Gina Anderson, whom I have already noted, produced the wonderful report, which is in part the stimulus for today's meeting. Gina is Philanthropy Fellow at the Centre for Social Impact at the University of New South Wales and an advisory board member of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission and chair of the Women's Community Shelters and a director of the George Institute for Global Health. For 5 years to 2010, Gina was Chief Executive of Philanthropy Australia, and we're honoured to have her address us on her report and on issues bearing on transparency. Genevieve is also welcome. Genevieve Timmins, philanthropic executive with the Portland House Foundation, a private family foundation established in Melbourne 9 years ago. The foundation works to a charter to assist people to move out of situations of disadvantage. Genevieve's career in philanthropy spans some 30 years with active engagement and giving at staff and governance level. She's currently director on the board of the George Hicks Foundation and the Inner North Community Foundation and a council member with Philanthropy Australia. She's also a board member with several not-for-profit organisations. Genevieve will be giving us a historical perspective from her considerable experience in the sector on the challenges for organisations which may or may not wish to improve their transparency record. Sarah Davis will finish off. Sarah is joined as CEO of REACH in 2011, an organisation focused on supporting and enabling young people to build their self-sufficiency, capacity, resilience and well-being. Prior to joining REACH, Sarah was CEO of the Australian Communities Foundation, a non-profit charitable foundation which enables accessible philanthropy and matches its donors' interests to emerging social issues. She's also a board member of a number of non-profits. Sarah will give us a perspective, not from the donor, but from the, from the non-profit side. So please welcome our four speakers.
As John said, today I'll be looking at grant-making transparency from international perspective, really to provide some sort of context to today's discussions. I'll be looking at 4 countries, so it will be brief on each country, and those 4 countries being England and Wales, the US and China. After that, I'll sort of review some of the voluntary initiatives that we're seeing across the globe. So just to begin with England and Wales. While England and Wales have had a Charities Commission, louder? I can't really, that's no microphone. While England and Wales have had a Charities Commission in some form or another since the mid-19th century, the current regulator is emerged in its current form really from around 2007 with the passage of the Charities Act of 2006. And the Commission has responsibility for oversight of all grant-making charities, who must provide the Commission with trustees' annual reports and accounts which are then made publicly available. And trustees' annual reports are actually quite comprehensive documents. They include information on the trustees, an actual contact detail, the standard financial review and the like, a statement of public benefit, and this was introduced also with the Act of 2006, in which charities, including grant-making charities, must explain how their activities accord with public benefits, which is an expanded version of the Elizabethan 4 heads of charity. It also has information on governance structure and the like. And all this information is actually made available publicly by the state on the Charity Commission's website. Excuse me. So what does a grant-making charities profile look like? And here I'll use the example of the Pears Foundation, which is a mid-sized philanthropic trust. First, has key headline information on where it operates. For example, we can see the Pears Foundation operates here in England and Wales, Israel, Scotland and the United States. Some sort of top line information on charitable spend, including information such as cost. So this is a very lean institution. We also see, and this was quite, I think, a controversial and contentious change, was listing of trustees on the website and any other related boards, also a principal contact detail. At the same time, there's a high-level charitable framework which has the charitable objects, as well as how they align with the Charities Act. And they also have extensive information through the accounts. So all accounts for a charitable trust are copied and sent to the Commission, which are then made available. But rather than sort of show you the quite extensive accounts, I'll show you one aspect which is probably of more interest, is material grants. So all grants are all material grants for a given year are essentially made available. So, what was the rationale behind this, the move towards more public reporting, and in particular making trustees' annual reports publicly available and easily accessible? Well, the policymakers at the time took the position that public reporting was essentially the best means by which to promote trust and public confidence in the sector, that this was the best mechanism by which to communicate to stakeholders, including the general public, not just the regulator. The Commission, or the policymakers, also took the view that availability of reports leads to immediate and wider accountability, and that's the sort of key principle behind reporting, and really that transparency was one key mechanism for accountability. In the United States, we have grant-making foundations. Like all private foundations, are registered with the IRS under 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. And again, they also must report to various state-based agencies, generally attorneys generals and the like. And the most far-reaching reforms, which is some time ago now, was the introduction of the Tax Reform Act of '69. And this was quite controversial at the time and actually occurred in quite a politically charged point in Foundation's history where they're under substantial congressional scrutiny. To that point there had been some sort of nefarious activities, some saw them as vehicles for tax avoidance, and there was limited checks on them. So the Act introduced a range of reforms, including the 5% rule, which we have a similar 5% payout rule, which we have a similar version of for PAFs in Australia in the more recent review. But importantly, it introduced new public reporting requirements. And these new reporting requirements were quite wide-ranging and included disclosure of the identities of donors and also the amounts donated, as well as disclosure of grant recipients and amounts distributed. And this information is provided to the IRS in the form of an annual tax form, the 990 PF. And this isn't an annual report, it's essentially a tax form, and foundations aren't required to produce annual reports, they're just encouraged to do so. And I'll just give you a quick rundown of a 990. So in a similar way to the UK, we have your sort of key financial information, some broad information on trustees, including here we have addresses, which, as well as anyone who receives a material salary from the foundation, as well as really top high-level information on grants. So again, this is pretty, high-level stuff, essentially size, addresses of organisations, etc. Just to touch on the Commission, or the IRS's views, or the legislators of the time, or the rationale behind the introduction of 990 PFs. And as we saw more recently in Australia and a continuing debate, there was much deliberation on how to balance the public's interest in the expenditure of their tax dollars with the privacy interests of donors. And ultimately, in the end, it was determined by the legislators that as private foundations leverage public money for privately selected charitable activities, there's a legitimate public interest in how these dollars are spent. And more broadly, as I noted, foundations were viewed with a bit of scepticism by some congressmen. So in the end, it was determined to make 990PFs publicly available. I put the word public in quotation marks, as while the foundation since '69 has been required to keep a hard copy on hand for anyone to rock up and request one or have one sent to them by mail, this often in practice has meant really lengthy delays and in effect has made them unusable or inaccessible. So however, with the growth of the internet in the late 90s, this really made 990PFs available to the public and indeed useful. And rather than publish these itself, the IRS actually turned to the private sector or the private side to make these available and facilitate access to them. So essentially it outsourced transparency to voluntary initiatives. And over the past several years, organisations like the Foundation Centre have made this information extremely accessible through sort of databases, data visualisation, video, social media and the like. And it's really made it available to those who want information on foundations. In the UK, as the major reforms were a more recent vintage, the states actually played a more prominent role in disseminating this information, which may be also an issue of political culture. So in effect, we sort of see these two slightly different dynamics. In the US, we have the IRS outsourcing to the private sector. In the UK, we have the state playing a more prominent role. And not surprisingly, again, we see a sort of third dynamic, or a very different dynamic, I should say, in China. Oops. That's a philanthropy insight tool, which is something that's run by the Foundation Centre, but Gina might talk through that.
Or not.
Or not? Okay. So essentially, in China, following a sort of series of damaging scandals in around 2009, 2010, I think, following the earthquake, the state decided that the sector needed to clean up its act, and there was much pressure put on the sector to, well, the sector was required to make their information publicly available. However, this process is still in train. And for the moment, we've actually have the China Foundation Centre, which is a private body, a private charity registered in China, whose mission is to bring transparency to the sector, is the main body in charge of, or the main organisation which is in fact facilitating transparency. And this has received quite there's a strong degree of interest in the work of the Foundation Centre in China, which is I think John's been involved with some arguing that it's actually producing some of the better use of data out of any of the private voluntary initiatives. So this is sort of a third dynamic in which there's a kind of hybrid public-private partnership, in a sense, to facilitate transparency. So just to sum up, I guess, although it's really been 40 years since the reforms of the Tax Reform Act and several years since the reforms in the UK, it's really, as John foreshadowed, strong and as yet unresolved and ongoing debates on the merits of transparency. And I think this is really best summed up in three sort of dominant views that we're seeing mainly in the literature at the moment. So on the one hand, we have respected legal scholars like John Tyler, who represents a conservative philanthropy roundtable, who really aim to dispel the myth, or they argue as a legal myth, that philanthropy is public money, essentially. And he argues that this has really been used to justify transparency when in fact there's significant legal opinion to show that it's not public money. On the other, we have sort of people like Brad Smith, who's CEO of the Foundation Centre in the US, who argue that transparency is perhaps the best means to protect freedoms, or the freedoms that foundations enjoy. And he argues that while it may be the case that the tax exemption that foundations enjoy does not necessarily differ from any other, foundations' challenges are more perceptual than legal. That is, foundations' increasing influence means they have a duty to be transparent, lest they be forced to by the shadow of regulation. And in keeping with this sort of line of reasoning is the open philanthropy doctrine, which is advocated by those such as Lucy Bernholtz of Stanford, which really builds on the idea of open source and open government. And she argues, along with others, that there's a need to move beyond compliance, essentially, to demonstrate effectiveness and share learnings and the like. And I guess at this stage it would appear, at least internationally, that the momentum is very much behind transparency, often from a voluntary perspective though.
Thank you very much.
This has been a Swinburne production.